Yeah, thanks so much for being here, everyone. Thanks for the invite in this wonderful workshop topic. I'm Nick Cheney, an associate professor at the University of Vermont. Really, what I want to get across in this talk are just two pieces. The first thing being that the evolution of things, morphologies in robotics is really important. And two, when we try and add in that triangle to include control with the evolution of morphology, things get surprisingly challenging, or at least it was surprising to me. To frame this into the workshop, this is primarily the first and last things that Chris just talked about half an hour ago. And I also come from the Pfeiffer and Bongard approach to thinking about how the body shapes the way you think. And we'll be framing a lot of this around the amount of computation that goes into robots traversing the world or performing complex behaviors, where traditionally think of your, Boston Dynamics robots spend a lot of compute trying to do planning, trying to do execution, where animals and robots with, I would say, well-designed morphologies can do these things much more effortlessly because they're set up to interact with their world in a smooth and meaningful way. I think that the most extreme example of this is the passive walking robot, where it has no controller whatsoever, but simply through the interaction of its body with physics is able to do this fairly complex bipedal locomotion task very effortlessly. 10 years later, in the room next door, I was really lucky to inherit this beautiful soft body physics simulator that was again trying to maximize the physical interactions between a system and physical forces. And being the evolutionary person I am, thought that, well, this is a very unintuitive design space. Let's see if we can evolve better robots than were hand designed by John, who built this beautiful simulator. We're again going to use CPPNs. Because by convolving over some image, we can get things that are really helpful for building robotic forms, like nice gradients from the input coordinates. We can get things like symmetry and repetition with the activation functions that you see within a CPPN. And very quickly, we have sparse representations in these evolved networks that lead to fairly complex phenotypes. Being interested in bio-inspired robotics, I really like that if you squint hard enough, the composition of these patterns within the CPPN feel to me like the composition of morphogens you see in early embryogenesis, which leads to the patterning of body types in biology, the things we're trying to replicate. Algorithmically, I really love the CPPNs and evolution paired together because you can do walks through some high-level feature space. These are all one mutation apart, and even though in pixel space they're very, very different from each other, they seem to be following some intuitive features in some abstract latent space, which makes our evolutionary process work much better. Inspired by the pick breeder work out of Ken Stanley's lab, and similarly a decade before from a similar work by Carl Sims, hooking up these CPPNs and evolution into an interactive art platform that just tried to maximize people's attention and clicks, we got what seemed like really complex, really biological looking forms. And so we set out to replicate this in a robotic paradigm. With our soft body simulator, we, again, inspired by the passive walking robot, tried to have as little control as possible. How interesting of behavior can we get just from the morphology? So there's no controller here, just two sine waves hooked up counterphase to our two muscle types. And we ask evolution to assemble this collection of Jello cubes in a way that moves as fast as possible. The behaviors that you see, I think, are really interesting, really organic feeling, really easy to anthropomorphize. But I also like the evolutionary aspect of this, that through the branching process of optimization, we get lots and lots of different types of behaviors, and ones that at least I wouldn't think of as a designer or an engineer to create a walking robot that moves like a gorilla on its front limbs. It wouldn't be something that I would think of. And so we had this system to evolve soft robots that could take advantage of their morphologies, and looked around to ask what kind of interesting soft behaviors are animals in biology doing with their morphologies, and found interesting things like this octopus that could unfold itself to escape out through a cave. We built lots of different tasks and environments. Another theme that's come up throughout the talks before. Here we have an underwater simulated aquatic environment, where we have these these tentacles growing on swimming robots. This is work by Francesco Carucci. And we asked, had to go back to origins of life and what happens when you take those tentacle robots and put them on land. Well, those tentacles become limbs when you transfer into a terrestrial environment. And weird things happen, like going the other way, thinking of mammals going back into the ocean. Things that are evolved first on land tend to be much beefier and blockier. They need to support their mass more and end up a little bit less tentacly and spindly, like some of the large mammals in the ocean, whales, for example. In a in a recent example that'll be presented in September, my student Alishan Martin also added in sensing to our passive materials, where depending on what environment the robot's in, the blue and red sensory voxels don't oscillate, but will just simply change shape, elongate or stretch. In here, we're essentially creating a dynamic morphology where the morphology, the body plan of the robot changes depending on what environment it's in. So the body plan on the left happens to be one that locomotes right. The body plan on the left happens to be one that locomotes left. But it's the same base robot morphology we're evolving to be able to dynamically change its shape and perform different behaviors. Here you see on the right different environments with different stimuli sets, and as a result, the robots are changing their morphology and performing different behaviors. Here we have an XOR gate being operated by the sensing materials to deform the robot's shapes. I think a really cool instance of kind of the walking passive robot on steroids here. It's been fun to see lots of people in the literature. This is Jean-Baptiste and Jeff hooking up our soft robot platform to map elites to try and show the quality diversity of behavior that we can get within this voxel platform. Again, a lot of interesting work's been talked about already in modular robots. Within this workshop, and I think that our voxel bots are a great example of the sort of open-ended design spaces we have here, even being discrete and relatively small dimensional, just 1,000 or so dimensions. Talking about the evolution of things, we've also spent a lot of time and thought about how we can think about the simulation to reality gap and transfer these robots into real physical systems. This is work led by Sam Kriegman in Josh Bongard's lab, building 3D printed robots that are pneumatically actuated. My favorite example that we tried, a team of undergrads, unfortunately didn't really work out to show you videos, but we tried also to build them out of the big square foam cubes you see in like kids' foam pits, so that we could have a robot that was big enough to actually ride around the field outside. It didn't work, but would have been fun. The example that we've talked about already and is simply mind-blowing is instantiating these things in real life with biological living frog cells. The Xenobots work, again, led by Sam Kriegman. And it's interesting also to see the evolutionary and CPPN aspects of this in the quality of diverse behaviors that we see, so that they were able to find robots that, for example, were able to forage through this environment and collect enough mass to quote unquote self-replicate. So we have these robots that just from morphology alone with no control can do what I think are interesting and amazing things. What if we make them smart? What if we add in control, actually try and unlock both the morphological computation, but also the traditional computation at the same time? So that's what we set out to do. Had these CPPMs spit out both the body plans of the robots as well as neural network controllers in the style of Neat. Sent these off to the supercomputer before leaving in the morning, hoping to come back to this parade of Jello cubes across the screen, as is, the very fun way to start your day, and absolutely nothing, crickets. The job had run, but search itself had converged, and absolutely nothing happened. I spent forever trying to chase down bugs in the code, banging my head against the wall to figure out what was happening, and eventually started talking to other people in the field. Hod, my advisor, Mikkel with this excellent A-Life work, and found that Actually, there's a lot of instances of premature convergence, especially in the morpho space, when we're trying to do brain-body co-optimization together. Things that you don't really see because we're really bad at publishing negative results until you go talk to the people who were implementing these things. And so we put out a negative results paper on the challenges of co-optimizing brain and body in soft robots. And you can see this in an example of one of the runs here, that each different color you see is a unique morphology. And after just a tiny fraction, 1% of optimization time, we've converged to what would end up being one of the best morphologies in the space. And we're not able to try any new body plans. It's not for lack of trying. You see all of these different colored robots, these rainbow sprinkles down at the bottom of the screen, where evolution has attempted morphological mutations, but they just get thrown out. So why is this? It's the title of today's talk, The Fragile Co-Adaptation of Brain and Body. I really like Randy Beer's figure here of brain-body environment systems, where the brain is the interface between the agent's nervous system and the outside environment, such that the brain and body become co-adapted to one another, and that co-adaptation creates fragility. That when you change the body, not only are you changing the physical body, but you're also changing the API, the interpreter by which the brain sees environmental stimuli or outputs motor actions. And so you're scrambling more of this system, you're making a larger mutation than you had intended to. For example, let's say we have a legged robot who's stagnated in its behavior, and we have a new morphology that ends up growing the length of the limbs. Now, ideally, longer limbs would let you traverse faster, but like any uncoordinated teenager, this robot stumbles upon its own feet, trips and falls over. It has fairly poor fitness, and evolution says, okay, that was a bad mutation. Let's throw that one out. But of course, we know that mutation should be a better morphology. This should be a positive mutation. So we take a trick and instead of doing single optimization evolution on fitness, now make it a multi-objective optimization to maximize fitness while minimizing the amount of time the brain and body have co-adapted to each other. So since this is a brand new morphology, the co-adaptation time is 0. The morphological age, quote unquote, of this robot is 0. And so it does really well with that minimize morphological age objective, and we keep it around, and lo and behold, doing a little bit more adaptation of the controller for that morphology, it ends up doing better than its parent. And we see this happening again and again and again, of new children initially doing worse, but then overtaking their parents after they've been able to readapt to this control paradigm. What you could do is a nested loop, like we saw earlier, entire control runs within each morphological mutation. Here we're doing it just as a single process that we think is a little bit more scalable as we try and scale these things up. That wasn't just a cartoon, that's actually real data, where this is the exact same initial conditions as I showed before with the rainbow sprinkles, but now we have this rainbow waterfall of not only progress increasing up and to the right, but lots and lots of color change of these overtakes of children becoming better and introducing kind of new best morphologies along the way. This is maybe even more apparent when we look at the robots themselves, that in a traditional approach, without nested evolution of controllers, you see stagnation very early on to the morphologies near initial conditions, where if we introduce this multi-objective trick to protect these morphological innovations, we get continued optimization in the morpho space, leading to convergence and escape from the local optima caused by fragile coadaptation. So we were trying to think, what is a way in which we can reduce the amount of controller readaptation we need to do each time we make a morphological mutation. At the extreme, wouldn't it be great if we just had one controller that could control all the morphologies in the space? So whenever you made a change to the body, your controller would automatically be good at controlling it. We did this by using map elites to create a quality diversity of one-to-one brain-to-body robots, and captured their state action pairs in some data set archive. And we used knowledge distillation to create one universal shared controller that was able to control all of the robots we'd seen before just as well as the one-to-one papers. This was just presented last week at Gecko, again, for my student Ali Jean. So we're just as good at the original morphologies we see in the search space. What happens when we look outside of our archive? So we do that by taking two random robots in the search space, interpolating linearly between them in morpho space, and it turns out that if you were to take, for example, the closest robot to one of these new unseen ones, the performance always dips down and does not quite as well as the ones trained on, unsurprisingly. What is surprising is that our distilled controller, this universal controller, sees almost no dip in performance as we interpolate between robots that are in our data set. In 70% of cases, and even more that are kind of very similar performance, we see that our universal distilled controller does best. What are other ways that we can think about making controllers that are more generalizable? We've heard a lot today about modular systems. Modular distributed controllers generally tend to be more robust and adaptable. We're trying to frame this as a transfer learning problem. So pulling in ideas from traditional machine learning, deep learning, thinking about not just transferring networks between tasks and data sets, but how do you transfer controllers between morphologies? And just in this simple test, looking at modular distributed controllers versus global centralized controllers in a zero-shot transfer, just taking a controller, putting in a new morphology, or a one-shot transfer, doing one extra generation of optimization on the controller, we see that modular distributed controllers work better than global ones. So there's room for improvement in the architectures in which we're trying to transfer. For even more for machine learning, our lab has been working a lot on meta learning the last few years. More broadly framing this as an adaptation and transfer problem where we can pull in ideas that are well established in deep learning. And I think that another connection that we're seeing is the relationship between this idea of brain-body co-optimization in robotics and the structure and weights of deep neural networks. And so our lab is really pushing on the connection between these two, and we're just awarded funding for the next 5 years to pursue this in depth of thinking about how do we take the ideas we've learned in evolutionary robotics and move them into neural architecture search. And we've already found preliminary results suggesting that there is fragile co-adaptation and specialization of weights to just some certain architectures during traditional neural architecture search problems. There's a whole body of work I talk about more if we had time on developmental processes and lifetime changes. That's been a theme talked about in the workshop so far. But I want to close up and just say that I hope the takeaways from this 15 minutes here were that embodied cognition and morphological computation, evolving things without controllers, is surprisingly powerful by itself. There's more promise when we try to add in complex controllers too, but also more challenges. And thinking about those challenges as a transfer learning, meta learning problem, I think, is a direction that we're headed, as well as looking for connections between the optimization of robot bodies and neural network structures. So thanks to an amazing set of collaborators on this work, especially Ali Jean-Martin and Sam Kriegman, Francisco Carucci, who've done a lot of the work on this, and some fantastic collaborators. I especially want to give a shout out to Josh Bongard, Hod Libson, Jeff Kloon, and the funding agencies who've believed in this work. Thanks to my lab as well at Vermont. We have some other talks throughout the week here that I hope you'll enjoy. And thanks to all of you for your attention.